Hello everyone, today in this video we will fight against the advanced character of our world around us, and this time we will have a trip to medieval Spain, mainly to Muslim Spain. And as many people know, the history of medieval Spain started with the invasion of Muslim, ethnically mainly Berber army under the Arab leadership of the Iberian Peninsula, on which in those days there was a Visigothic kingdom that was the successor of Roman Spain. They conquered Roman Spain 3 centuries before, and they were ruling it almost entire territory after conquering Swabian kingdom in 585 AD. And they were of course Arians. They were followers of the Arian heresy in the first period of their history. Later Recared, their king, actually switched to Catholicism that facilitated the assimilation of Gothic people into Romano-Spanish population, one can say, of those days, so to Mediterranean ethnos, using the terminology of Lev Gumilov. And the state was culturally developing, but politically was unstable. The conflicts within the Visigothic royal family and ruling group, and also not so obedient landowners, everything generated many problems. And these problems Muslims realize in 710 AD, when they made 1 year before the conquest started and 1 day before they defeated Roderick, the last king of Visigoths, and his army. They made a reconnaissance in 710, and they realized what's the situation in Visigothic Spain those days, and they were encouraged to start the conquest. Of course, first, let's say 40-50 years after the conquest were very, I would say, turbulent, because military leaders and tribal leaders and Visigothic lords, former Visigothic lords, were fighting for their new positions in the new reality. On the north, the Christian kingdoms under the rule of local lords and one of the former Visigothic lord, Pelayo, in other language just known as Pelagius, survived and started battling Muslims slowly. But at this stage of history they were actually organizing themselves and partially fighting for survival, Christian kingdoms on the north. Muslim territory got some order and unification when the only one survivor of the Umayyad dynasty who escaped the slaughter, which was actually done to Umayyads by victorious Abbasids in 750 AD. He escaped from Syria, and after some years, in 756, he was asked by some Berber faction and Arabic faction fighting with another in Moorish Spain to lead them and to rule them. Of course, he had nothing to lose. He couldn't back to Syria, so he just used this opportunity, was lucky and gifted, and Mr. Abd al-Rahman I just got his kingdom and he became Emir of Cordoba. Of course, he started great constructions because of his palace, mosque, because he wanted new territories to resemble the Syria his family lost and he loved so much, the country from his childhood. Nostalgic story, but at least he gave some peace and at least some law and order to Spanish people of any religion. Yeah, of course, there was a strict dominance of Muslim element, especially Muslim military for long, but other religions like Christian, Jewish, and other Muslims, with the exception of Shias that were not welcome there, were living in relative peace. And quite good prosperity, because under the iron hands of first and next emirs, trade was actually ongoing, prosperity was growing, and country was developing. Yeah, on borderlands between Christian kingdoms and freshly formed Moorish Spain kingdom, there were many clashes, but okay, it's fine. And the descendants of Abd al-Rahman I, Abd al-Rahman III, in 1929, proclaimed himself a caliph, mainly in the opposition also to the Abbasid, but first of all to the Shia Fatimid Caliphate. He also proclaimed himself caliph in Cordoba. Very good achievement. This was the height of the Islamic Spain, political and cultural. Maybe he didn't extend the Islamic Spanish possessions in terms of territory, but it was the apogee of prestige, cultural influence, and also beginning of another cultural development. Of course, cultural development started a little bit earlier in 9th century. The huge impact on them. One guy who escaped from the court of Abbasid, artist, musician, dancer, and poet Ziryab, actually started. But this is another story for another movie, also funny story. But coming back to the main narrative, we see that Islamic Spain was developing, but unfortunately Caliphate didn't last very long, because two successors of Abd al-Rahman III, actually one of my favorite from these caliphs, were really powerful and kept this what they inherited, but unfortunately at the end of 10th century and in the very beginning of 11th century, the power over the state was in the hands of Chambellan of a youngster caliph al-Hakam, and unfortunately Chambellan was of course a very powerful military leader, because he wanted to justify his rule, and he was riding on the north on Christian possessions, 57 campaigns, and he even plundered very holy place for Roman Catholics, Christians, Santiago de Compostela. He took bells from them, he put them as chandeliers into the great mosque of Cordoba. Very great achievement, but the problem is that these campaigns, despite the fact they were successful, he was losing people, because of course in fighting, marches, diseases, so he needed more military personnel. So he was importing military personnel from Morocco, from the territory of modern Morocco. These people are Berbers, very simple minded, very good warriors, but also very religious people, almost fanatic, and they didn't feel in the prosperous Muslim Spain well, where the religious rules were not so strict and many followers of other religions were living among them. But as long as Almanzor, Chambellan, was alive, everything seemed to be well. But when he died in 1002, the problem started, and actually fractions of Berbers were fighting with each other and were fighting with the local Andalusia Muslims, and also tensions between the ethnic and religious minorities arise, as it always takes place in such moments. And even in 1010, Berbers plundered the great palace of caliphs that was established a little bit earlier by my favorite Abd al-Rahman III. And at the end of the day, in 21 years later, in 1031, the Caliphate of Cordoba completely ceased to exist, and the Muslim state was divided into small party kingdoms of petty kings, I would call them, taifas. They were called taifas. Culture was still flourishing because its city was competing with another, like Granada with Seville, Alameda, and other stuff. But the problem is that there was another bad consequences of Almanzor's raids on the north that and stalking Christian kingdoms because they started collaborating, and after a few years over the divided Islamic Spain, Christian power arose, and they started really reconquest on a larger scale, and were quite successful because in 1085, without fighting surprisingly, but they conquered Toledo. And when we look in the map, when they conquered Toledo, they just entered like knife enters the butter into the territories of Spanish Muslims, and they started dividing them. And the next to be conquered was the Taifa petty king of Seville, Mr. Mutamid, who was actually patron of many poets, artists, and poet himself. He was also a not so stupid politician, and he knew, oh, mom, I'm the next. So he was considering, actually, considering the considering what to do, and he decided to ask Almoravid for help. And Almoravids were a Berber dynasty that decided to come back to the clear, pure, simple rules of Islam to restore the order of the world. Of course, these were the simple, pure rules of the religion, as it always happens in such times of the crisis, that people want to come back to simple and pure rules. These were the simple and pure rules these Almoravid leaders and their theological helpers were imagining that pure Islam should look like. Maybe it had not so much in common with the primary version of Islam, but it was the version of Islam how they imagined that it should look like. So they started conquest in the west corner of the North Africa. They created quickly empire from Senegal to Tanger. Very impressive. And were very good, simple-minded, very religious Muslims who were dedicated for their profession, which was fighting. And Mutanid, against the advices of his son, asked them for help. Of course they came. They defeated Christian armies in few battles, but geopolitically somehow nothing changed. The geopolitical situation of Muslim petty kings in Spain didn't improve much. They came for the first time to help them in 1086 AD, but later they realized, especially the leader of Almoravid, Ibn Tashufin, who was also known for his longevity, almost 100 years of life, he decided that okay, it's hard to negotiate with such allies who are fighting with each other. Instead of fighting the enemy from the north, Almoravids decided to conquer all Muslim Spain, and it happens in the second half of 1080s, so the 80s of the 11th century, and Mr. Mutanid lost his power like many other petty kings, and he ended his life in the prison in Morocco, nowadays territory of Morocco, writing beautiful poems full of nostalgia for lost Al-Andalus. Mr. Mutanid, actually, it's a very interesting story. I really don't like when current propaganda wants to always emphasize that some of the modern some of the famous artists, poets, or writer, that they were homosexuals, and they assign, which is not true, that they were supporting, despite the fact they were living in the past, LGBT whatever rules. and they do not want to remember about such artists and politicians and very good poet like Mr. Mutanid, who was, despite the fact he had a son, as I mentioned before, he was also a homosexualist because he had many poets and many artists he supported, but he also was interested in their performance in the bedroom. And with Mr. Mutanid, there is also another anecdote that when his son was actually begging him not to ask Almoravids for help because, according to him, it's not a good idea, that wouldn't finish well. Mr. Mutamid said that he would prefer to die in the prison among the followers of his own faith than to graze pigs among the Castilians. As he said, he got it. His wishes got fulfilled. He rotten in the prison in the northern, nowadays, Morocco, writing his beautiful nostalgic poems. Later, Almoravid Empire collapsed about 80 years later, so 80, 90 years later, under the blows of another religious movement from Moroccan Berbers, Almohads, who considered Almoravids to be to betray simple and proper religion, that they got spoiled by Al-Andalus influences and other influences of modern life. So Almohads conquered the Almoravid territory, but their empire also collapsed quite quickly in the beginning of the 13th century AD, and the last remnants of Muslim Spain, Emirate of Granada, lasted for about 250 years to the 2nd of January 1492, in which the Muhammad XII, the last Emir of Granada, gave the key to Granada to Isabel de Castile and her husband Ferdinand of Aragon, a great Catholic, the great couple of Catholic monarchs who united the Spanish lands and finished the political presence of Moors, so Muslims, in the Spanish territory. Presence of Muslims continued in Spain until 1614 AD, when the last Moriscos, so crypto-Muslims who converted to Catholicism but still were practicing or were just suspected of practicing Islamic practices, were expelled from Spain. So we see that sometimes we have to be careful what we say, because like poor Mutanid, who invited Almoravids to help him, and later Almoravids realized that Andalusi Muslims are not really Muslims because they succumb to the goodness of the materialistic life, and they are hard to negotiate with and collaborate with. That's why they conquered them. So poor Mutanid, as he said, he rotten in the Muslim prison, and he was not grazing the pigs among Castilians. So this is also good story to tell, that sometimes geopolitical choice we have, it's very difficult, but before we make a decision what we choose, it's actually for our elites, we should really think what's the most and the least damaging option to us. In my opinion, Almoravid rule was not the best what could happen for Islamic Spain, because for about almost 2 centuries the development of its culture was largely halted. Later it continued a little bit in small Granada under the last dynasty Al-Nasrids, but it was not the same. So in my opinion, this is a good example how sometimes people can find themselves between hammer and anvil, regardless of the side one chooses. The choice one makes brings enormous and very often drastic consequences, but still I think that this is a good example for the geopolitical study, and a good example for really serious politicians to think and take lessons from this example. All the best, have a nice day, bye.